in speaking about the young athlete, I think the biggest thing we have to continually focus on is just building athleticism. And I encourage athletes to play as many sports as possible up until
Ardiaga drives one to center. Miller hustling over. Diving catch by Ian Miller. A great catch.
3, 2, 1. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the 9-Hole Podcast. This is your host, Ian Miller. Man, I don't even know how I want to intro this man right here. I've been fortunate enough to have, players on, coaches on, people that have been instrumental to my success, people that I've looked up to. Today is no different, but it's in a different sector, right? It's in the sport performance sector. This is somebody that I've personally gone to when I was in the biggest time of my life, right? So 2019, I got an opportunity in the big leagues. 2020, right? During the offseason, it was instrumental for me to make sure that I surrounded myself with the highest quality people and the people that knew the most, the people that could take me, where I wanted to go, but also people that I could learn from, look up to. Today, it is an absolute honor. It is an honor to have on to my show, Mickey Brueckner. Mickey, what's going on, brother? How you doing? The CEO of the Annex Sports Performance. How you doing, bro?
I'm doing well, brother. What an introduction. Hopefully I'll live up to the hype. I appreciate you.
Dude, oh man, the pleasure's all mine, dude. How is everything going right now with you, with the facility, dude? So I stopped by New Jersey last week, obviously stopped by the Annex, see what was going on, and spring training had already started, and your place was packed with baseball players, obviously getting ready for the minor league portion of spring training. Mm-hmm. What is the day-to-day grind like right now? What's going on over at the Annex?
Yeah, so we kind of said goodbye to our first crop of like big league invites for spring training back like towards the beginning of February. Pitchers, catchers, and then position players shortly after. And so now like we have a lot of like minor league guys who are waiting for their minor league camp to start, which is in a couple weeks. But otherwise it's we've got some guys who are like undrafted, like free agents who are looking to get picked up, whether it be indie ball or hopefully some affiliate teams. So it's really just a lot of guys who are trying to create opportunities for themselves and put themselves in the best case scenario to kind of go out and compete when they have the opportunity. So, we're heavily populated with the baseball athletes. So I think this time of year, like we still have a lot of our high school kids. We've already said goodbye to all of our college guys back in January. So we'll slow down a little bit as, mid-March starts up, because in New Jersey, that's when a lot of our spring athletes start their season. So at that point, a lot of those athletes will transition from like an off-season program to training in season, which is really all that means is they're training, instead of training 3 to 4 times a week, they're 1 to 2 times a week, and the training is just a little bit different. So
I love it.
Yeah.
I love it. So you guys are located in Chatham, New Jersey, which is North New Jersey. Fantastic spot. I lived there in Chatham. What was it? The off season after 2019, right? So going into 2020, man, I shacked up in Chatham. It was fantastic. I had the opportunity to come work out with you. Amazing. I've never had a better spring training, better season, right? I haven't been more prepared than after coming to you, man. It's fantastic. I was actually referred to you by somebody that I respect in the industry, who was a scout and is currently a scout for the Seattle Mariners, Dave Pepe, who introduced my wife and I. Man, he was instrumental in saying, hey, you're going to be living in North New Jersey. I reached out. I said, dude, where do I go? Where do the best athletes in North New Jersey go to train? Right? He said, dude, you got to go to Mickey. Here's his number. Here's the website. Reach out to him. At the time, I'm not sure if he knew that Porcello was there. We'll get into that a little bit, but he specifically said Leiter was there, right? So, I mean, we'll touch on those guys a little bit. Jack is obviously an absolute stud. I think he was maybe a sophomore at Vanderbilt, I think, at the time. Dude, insane. Changed kind of like the trajectory, that's a crazy word, of my last 2 years. So I ended up spending the offseason with you and going into spring training ready, like beyond words. I was more ready than I've ever been, dude. I kind of want to just pick your brain a little bit, hear a little about the story on how you got into the game. How'd you get into the industry, and how are you here right now?
Yeah. I mean, I think if you ask most strength coaches who get into this world, is they were all former athletes with goals and ambitions of being professional athletes themselves, and I was certainly no different. I was a kid who grew up in New Jersey. All I ever wanted to do was play baseball, so I had the goals and ambitions of playing pro ball. I'd like to think I was good enough, based on the trajectory of my career. Had a scholarship out of high school. Played my first year and a half was at Seton Hall University. Transferred to a junior college in Arizona. Was projected to be drafted in the top 5 rounds, and then blew my elbow out and had Tommy John surgery in spring of 2003, and then had my second Tommy John surgery in spring of 2004. So, after the first surgery, it was one of those things where, like, yeah, I'll be fine. I'm gonna come back from this. I'll be stronger. And at the time in 2003, like, still was not a big thing yet. Like, it hadn't hit the level that it is now currently in the game. And so, like, I was very optimistic, and I think through my rehabilitation process, I re-injured it in the throwing program. And a year after the first one, I ended up having to have a revision. And at that point, I was like, you know what? Now that the thoughts started to creep in, like, all right, well, it's definitely not a sure thing. I think I have a much larger mountain to climb. But I started to think in terms of, like, all right, well, if this baseball dream doesn't work out, what do I love the most? So I always loved training, right? I was a really good baseball player. I had the skills. I was a great hitter. I was a switch hitter. I hit for power. I had great, like, arm strength and all those types of things. So I had all the tools. But as I got into high school, I needed to work on athleticism. And so I think it was my sophomore year in high school, I started to get into training, and I just found that I just absolutely loved it. And it changed my outlook in every other aspect of my life, right? I wasn't the greatest student. I had ADD as a kid, and just couldn't focus on anything. But as soon as I found training, I started to realize, like, the principles of being disciplined and chasing any one goal or any one, like, task. Like, as long as you put enough time and energy and effort, consistent effort, into anything, and have patience, you'll see it through. And training really started to create that framework for me. And so that's why I fell in love with it. And so when I started into my second rehab, I was like, all right, I was going to school at Arizona State at the time. I was studying kinesiology. So at that point, I was like, I was still in the track I was trying to play, right? I was still like, I'm going to still do everything I can. I'm going to train. I'm going to do all the stuff I need to do to get back. But I started to take internships. I interned at the same facility I did all of my physical therapy at, my post-op care. And then not only did I intern there, but I trained there and I coached there. And so I kind of saw the evolution. It was a facility that was very unique. Nothing like this, like that, ever existed in New Jersey. So anyway, I get to the end of my career. I finish up at Arizona State. It was not the player I was before my first injury, and at that point, I was like, it's very clear that I physically, like, I don't have the ability to kind of get back in the game. Like, the game has passed me by, and it was an unfortunate thing, right? It was an emotional time, and I'm sure you experience, most ball players experience it when they realize they're coming to the end of their career. Something that was their identity for their whole entire life. It was a challenge, but I was very fortunate that I had the opportunity to come back to New Jersey and start the Annex. So it was a very binary decision for me. Like, at that point, I was done chasing baseball, and then I essentially took all that effort and energy that I took into trying to be a baseball player, and I shifted into starting my business. So that was in 2006. I moved back home, started utilizing a lot of the contacts and network that I had as a high school student here. Um, and the rest is history. It was something that I knew that I'd be successful in it, given the fact that, like, I know that as long as it took just hard work and dedication and consistent effort, I'd make it work, right? And I knew the training. I just knew nothing about running a business. So, like, I continue to get better as a coach and continue to get better as a business owner. So that's kind of how I got into where I am today, and that was 18 years ago. And now we're at a facility where we're continually building that reputation, and we're still working with ball players. That was always the goal. I knew that I could create a niche in the market that wasn't there, that I knew we or myself, and then ultimately the Annex could do better than nobody else.
Ooh,
So
dude, that's elite. That's fantastic. So, like the having two Tommy Johns or two, elbow surgeries, right? Two elbow procedures led
yeah,
you to this point. It is unfortunate, right? Like it's crazy to see. It's
yeah,
crazy to say, excuse me, but like every athlete's going to share one thing, and it's like, dude, your career's going to end at some point. You're going to take the jersey off for the last time. Yeah, it's a hard pill to swallow. Obviously, if you have a fallback option, if you have, if you are passionate about something, it might make that fall, a little bit easier to land, dude. So I wanted to touch on like you're not just working with elite throwers of the baseball, right? So you specialize in overhead throwers of multiple sports, dude. So I alluded to, Al Leiter's son, right? Jack Leiter was there. Eli Manning was there, right? Who is surprisingly big, dude, and he's huge, right? He's tall,
yeah,
huge.
yeah.
Rick Porcello was like he would just personally go to you, man. But dude, you're also like, okay, so baseball, football, softball, lacrosse, field hockey, soccer, swimming, All Americans, Cy Young Award winners, Gatorade National Players of the Year, several Team USA Junior Olympic athletes, right? Like,
Yeah.
how did you get into the football space, man? So obviously you have the background in baseball. You've established yourself as a dude in your industry in North New Jersey, working with literally the most elite athletes in New Jersey. I'll say it. I'll say it. How did you get into the football space? Now you're doing what QB country, right? So you're
Yeah.
running quarterback camps. Like, how'd you get into all this?
Yeah, I mean it's unique, right? Like for me, like I don't really pursue anything that I don't really truly think I can provide value in. And I saw, like, you look at the evolution of strength and conditioning and just overall performance development in baseball, like it had to get better, right? Like the amount of injuries and the level of, stress on the arm, like training had to evolve to meet the needs of the athletes. So baseball has certainly been ahead of that curve. Like I think in the past years, like I mean, we still have a lot of ground to make up, I believe, but I think, based on the way training looked 10, 15 years ago, it's way better and it's drastically different. And I think it's certainly meeting the needs of the athletes. That being said, I was completely underwhelmed with what was being offered to quarterbacks. And if you look at the mechanics of throwing a football versus a baseball, yeah, there's some nuance and slight differences to it. But at the end of the day, the kinematic sequence that's happening throwing a baseball versus throwing a football, it's not all too different, right? It's, if you look at the interaction with the pelvis and the trunk and the upper arm, the arm and the hand, and all those things have to work efficiently to create arm speed. There's some nuance to the difference, right? The biggest thing is football is chaotic, right? There's a time component to it. There's no, other than the pitch clock, there's really no time component to delivering a baseball. There can be a lot of variability and variance in terms of, like, how guys create deception or not deception and things like that. So I think I essentially, like I said, I saw the opportunity to create value in the quarterback industry. And so I come at it as slightly different lens. Yes, I do work with quarterbacks from a skill side. Like I'm on field with them. I do, traditional quarterback training. I'm very clear with the athletes and parents that I work with that I come at it from the lens of a biomechanist. I'm not a football guy. I can't speak to the X's and O's, but I'll get any passer to move more efficiently and create better arm strength, better arm speed, become more resilient, more robust. Just like I aim to do the same thing with my pitchers and position players. So that was kind of how it all happened. How it the essentially the introduction was Eli and Al were neighbors in the adjacent town. And I think one off season, Eli was talking to Al, like, yeah, I want to do some of this and that. And and Al's like, well, you absolutely have to go see Mickey, right? No different from, your
Dave, yeah,
scout
Dave Pepe.
who introduced you to me. So essentially, thankfully Al was kind enough to make that connection. And, so Eli started working with me towards the end of his career. And then how I got connected with quarterback country is David Morris, who was Eli's essentially backup at Ole Miss. He's the person who started quarterback country down in Mobile, Alabama. And so he came up to work towards the end of the off season to get ready, to get Eli ready for OTAs in March. He came up to do like a field session with him, and he and I just started talking and started to build a relationship, and over time just again saw a gap in the market here in New Jersey. And I'm like, look, I think I can do this. I think I can provide value not only to your company but the quarterbacks in this area, because I know there's a lot of stuff they're not getting from the performance side, and I can provide that. And so that was how it all kind of started, and so that was in 2019. And so
Dude, that's fantastic.
yeah,
It's
so it's been
amazing.
fun. I mean, it's like I always believe that my context and career as a baseball player has always helped me to meet baseball athletes where they're at, right? Understanding all the nuance of the game, and all the little things like that, unless you're like a baseball purist, you don't really know. Like a lot of the stuff these athletes are going through, I went through myself, right? I the only thing I didn't experience is pro ball, right? Like, and I got to the highest levels of college baseball, but through the experiences of the athletes I now work with and have worked with, like there's not a lot I haven't been exposed to. And so I think for me, I got involved with quarterback country because I think that provided me the context to work with quarterbacks, much like my experience through baseball allowed me to work with my baseball athletes. So
Mm,
it was like I feel like some people might say that that doesn't matter, but I really do believe it matters. And to be honest, like I had to teach myself how to throw. Like I could throw a football, but I threw it like a baseball player. Now I can throw a football like a quarterback. So, and I had to teach myself, and so through teaching myself, I think it allows me to create better experiences with my athletes. And yeah, I mean it's been a fun evolution, and I've really enjoyed learning about it. And ultimately I think it's been a really fun part of my evolution as like a coach, right?
yeah. Love it, dude. So the teaching and the learning aspect, I kind of wanted to dive into it a little bit. Obviously, like overhead throwing athletes, is if we're alluding to softball, baseball, quarterbacks, man, they may train a certain way, but depending on the sport you're in, maybe that workout program or how that looks, how you train, how you attack, may be a little bit different. Especially if we're in season, if we're off season. I
Hmm.
kind of wanted to dive into that a little bit, but first, I'd love to get a shout out to the sponsor of today's stream, the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society, the Cleveland Student Visionaries of the Year, philanthropic leadership development program for exemplary high school students. Woo! Highly motivated leaders embark on a journey of professional growth, fostering professional skills such as entrepreneurship, marketing, and project management, all while working to raise as much money as possible for the fight against blood cancer, the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society. Links in the description. The donate link is up there on the banner. Appreciate everybody for tuning in. Appreciate you guys over at the LLS for sponsoring. Man, I wanted to talk about, like I said, kind of the learning and the teaching and the training, and maybe how they kind of coincide, how they're similar, how they're alike. Um, why do overhead throwing athletes train differently? What is the focus, and like what is the difference between maybe how you train a baseball player and how you train and work with a dude like Eli Manning when he's playing, right? Like how would a pitcher train and how would a quarterback train? And then maybe like how is that similar?
Yeah, I mean I think it's any strength conditioning program is you kind of have to meet the athlete where they are and kind of look at like what's their biggest limiting factor, right? What things can they do better to make marketable improvement, right? Because if you look at athletes that are at that level, it's like clearly they do a lot of good stuff, right? But there's always things that we can improve upon. Um, so I look at everything through the lens of movement, right? And when you look at a quarterback versus a pitcher, like again, the movement isn't all too different. The time component is one of the biggest things, right? If you look at the 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 sequencing of throwing a football versus the sequencing of throwing a baseball is football is a lot twitchier. It has to happen like on at like a second notice. Um, a lot of times you're throwing on the run, you're throwing off platform, you're throwing in different scenarios where you're trying to evade a defensive end and stuff like that. So it's not an ideal scenario. Whereas there's always like throwing a baseball, it's like everything is somewhat controlled, right? Like like your windup's going to be your windup, or you're going to throw from the stretch. Like those are the only two variables in baseball, right? Even the pitch, you're going to throw is predetermined between you and the catcher. So the biggest difference is like the nuance between like pitcher to pitcher, whether they're a power pitcher or finesse pitcher or like a deceptive pitcher, like those types of things. Like everybody's windup is slightly different. But at the end of the day, if you look at a kinematic sequence, really simply put is, there's an acceleration and deceleration of each segment. So if you look at the pelvis, has to interact with the trunk has to interact with the scapula on the rib cage, the scapula has to interact with the humerus, and then the humerus is what accelerates, in terms of internal rotation and in the, different stages of throwing motion. That's what accelerates the hand, right? And whether it's a football or a baseball, like all that sequence has to happen with a rapid acceleration and then deceleration of one segment before it goes to the next. And that's where I think everybody's seen a guy throw a football or a pitcher throw a baseball where the ball just explodes out of their hand and it looks completely effortless, right? Like that's an
Like
individual
lighter.
that's an individual with a really efficient kinematic sequence. Like they utilize every bit of energy starting from the first segment to the last, right? Versus somebody who maybe puts a lot of effort into their throwing, but they just struggle to connect the dots at the end. And those are the guys that like they look like they're throwing hard, but they're maybe high 80s or those types of things. So I think the biggest difference is like the training for a baseball player is there's a lot greater arm speeds, right? Like throwing a baseball is much lighter. It's a 5-ounce ball versus, I forget the weight of the football, but it's much heavier. So that's why you see a lot less arm injuries like elbows and shoulders and stuff like that. So you really need to prepare a baseball player for that. So ton of dedicated arm care, ton of like really understanding workload and volume and all that stuff, and how training interacts with that, and making sure you're managing all those stressors. Football, I would say it's not quite as a challenge as you'd look at like starting pitchers or relievers in baseball. The biggest difference, other than the time component that you look at with quarterbacks, is they're sustaining big hits. So they need to be a little bit more resilient, right? So the much like an outfielder diving for a ball, and you have the risk of like dislocation or subluxation of a shoulder joint or a wrist joint or things like
Dude,
that.
I remember we would work
Yeah.
on off shoulder exercise, not to
Yeah.
cut you off. I get
Yeah.
it.
But so from like an upper body strength perspective, you need to just build them up a little bit more. So I look at training athletes on a continuum, right? If you look at somebody who's like a power lifter or a lineman or like a big strong dude, they're very rigid, they're very, very stiff, and that stiffness lends better to their sport, right? Like if I'm a lineman, I don't want to rotate. If I'm a power lifter, I want to be as rigid as possible so I can load up my body as much as possible. So essentially the demands of my training are meeting the demands of my sport, right? So that's on one end of the continuum versus variability. So variability is like I can move in infinite planes of motion. I can move in and out of different energy systems. I have a ton of bandwidth and ability to move just freely and efficiently. Pitchers, throwers, quarterbacks, we need a decent amount of variability. I would say pitchers need more. Quarterbacks need a little bit of stiffness and rigidity because they're sustaining hits. And that's the simplest way I can put it in terms of like a frameworks, right? But I would say like the needs for arm care, the needs for like making sure you're managing training programs, arm care programs with throwing programs, that's the ways that, like, again, baseball's gotten really good at that stuff because they had to in order to mitigate the risk of injury. Football hasn't really gotten there yet. So to me, it's less about injury prevention with football players, and it's more about like, well, we're leaving a ton of performance on the table here with these guys. If we were to actually start focusing on these things, like the longevity will go up in their career, the performance will go up in their career. And I think for me, like that's what I'm really looking at is like, how can I take a really good athlete and make them better, make them more resilient, make them more robust, right? So not only are they competing at the highest level, but they can do it for longer. So
That's huge. Dude,
yeah.
that's huge. So like I learned throughout my career, obviously like this is the 9 Hole podcast where like I'm trying to provide some sort of insight or education, you know what I mean, to like the next generation of underdogs, undervalued, you know what I mean, undersized players.
Mhm.
And like coming up, dude, I kind of learned, dude, this is dead serious. Like I had to learn how to work out and how to work, how to train in the gym from other people, either that were on my team or YouTube, right? Or people that I looked up to. Dude, so I'm a freshman in college, right? And I'm at Wagner College. No knock against Wagner, but the facilities and the resources may be a little bit less than a Power Five school, right? Rutgers or St. John's, or it's just something along those lines, dude. So we're cycling in and out different strength and conditioning coordinators. I'm
Yeah.
working with different people with different experiences. I don't have a relationship with them. We're doing some crazy workouts. I remember, dude, my freshman year, stuff's hurting me. My elbow's hurting me. I gotta go get an MRI on my elbow because I can't like throw in the gym, dude. I'm in the gym doing Brock Lesnar workouts. You know who Brock Lesnar is? The UFC fighter, the
Yeah.
big dude who's now in WWE. Like, dude, I was doing those type of workouts as an overhead throwing, like, I'm trying to make the team as a freshman, and I am maxing out bench. I'm maxing out with my deadlifts on the same day, and then I'm blowing out with pull-ups, dude. It's like I don't necessarily know what I'm doing. So it's
Mhm.
awesome that you're on here kind of schooling us, giving us a little bit of education in the different times of year, right? So whether it's the off season, maybe building as opposed to like in season maintaining, man. Are there different plans? Are there different like programs, ways to attack that? Like I wasn't, dude, when I was working with you in the off season, I'm not max benching every
Mhm.
week, right? Like we would load up to the max. I love that. I would know that we would be X percent of what I think my max is, right? Like you would structure these
Yeah.
programs in a certain way to kind of like, I don't even know how to say it, but like you would progress and then you would decel a little bit. Like, has
Yeah.
that always been the philosophy? Is that how you work specifically with baseball players in the off season?
I mean, I think it's how we manage volume and overall just like stress on the nervous system is we look at that with all of our athletes. Um, I think the biggest thing is like most people look at strength and conditioning programs as like exercises, whereas again, looking at it through the lens of biomechanics and movement, I look at it as movement. So we want to be squatting, we want to be hinging or deadlifting, we want to be pushing, we want to be pulling, and from there, like if we can hit a lot of those things, we want to create power in multiple planes. We want to sprint, we want to accelerate, we want to hit top speed. We want to do all those things, and it's a matter of like, all right, if I can check all those boxes, how am I doing it at different parts of the year? So I mean, if you want, I can go through like early off season to late off season to in season. So
Yeah.
really, just to keep it as simple as possible. So for me, let's start in like the early off season. So for example, we get an athlete. We'll use a baseball player in this example. We get a baseball player who's wrapped up his season. In this case, let's use you as an example, right? Like you're a pro ball player, or even a college ball player, right? Like you finished up. This is fall, maybe September, end of September, October, whenever. We kind of use the first 2 weeks of that off season, and we try to make things as basic as possible, right? Because if you look at all the things you've been doing for the last 6 to 8 months, it's been super high velocity, super high intensity, and you've been executing these things in all these different planes, right? Like transverse frontal, like if you look at the way you hit and throw and all those things, we want to get you away from that. We
Mm.
want your training to be the furthest thing as we can away from that. Reason being is it creates a foundation through which we're going to build throughout the whole rest of the off season, right? So we want to start exposing them to loads. We want to create a base of conditioning, right? Because think of conditioning as your ability to increase your ceiling, right? Like your resistance to fatigue or your ability to continually execute high intensity movements over time. Right? Like I think a lot of people get into trouble with power athletes. Like, well, if you over condition them, you're going to detrain their ability to be explosive. And I
Mm.
disagree to an extent because what I look at as conditioning for power athletes, like for somebody like you were super fast, but like we needed to create fatigue resistance. And so if you had no conditioning, your ability to maintain that high level of outputs over a long period of time would diminish pretty fast. And so that being said, we'd create those 2 weeks and we would just like super basic, nothing heavy, just like time under tension. Even the plyometric work we would be doing, we call it extensive plyos. So low intensity, low amplitude, a lot of volume. And so again, looking at things from a continuum, I look at, not only do I look at like rigidity and stiffness and variability, but I look at all of our strength work and all of our development on a continuum of force and velocity. So in season, we're executing everything high on the velocity end of the curve, right? With higher velocities, we're generally using less loads, less forces. Well, we want to get everybody early off season more towards the force end and away from the velocity, because we want to start training those good qualities that we can create a foundation. So the first really like 4 to 6 weeks of the off season is just getting them back to training, getting them back to like their tissue ready to receive load and move loads and stuff like that. Generally we're working off of like very subjective scales like RPEs or reps in reserve, right? Like, so we're hitting, hey, today's our big lift, our squat day. We're going to do a safety bar squat or a safety bar split squat based on, what movement suits you. And we're going to go at an RPE 8 or 2 reps in reserve, right?
Mm.
Like 1 week that might mean one weight, and then the other week based off of readiness that might be another weight. But at this point of the year, I'm just trying to build a base of strength and conditioning.
Love it.
So as we get closer to like throwing, hitting, running at high velocities, like we always want to be ahead of those things. Like from the skill perspective, we want to be touching those movements long before you're experiencing them with a bat or a ball in your hand, right? We want to experience and expose you to those stressors before you do, like on a baseball field.
100%.
So as the off season goes on, we're just shifting away from that high force to more high velocity movement. So, with our well developed athletes that have like a really long training age, many of the guys that we're working with, like they would fall under the category of being strong enough, right? So for example, if I have an athlete that can deadlift 405 for reps, asking them to try to get to like 500 for reps, like it just has diminishing returns. Like the risk for me is not worth the reward. So with those athletes, we start utilizing things like VBT, or what we call velocity based training, through tendos, or making sure, instead of saying like, all right, now we're being a little bit more objective with the loads we're moving, and saying like, you're moving the goal is to move the bar at this speed, so that we know we're training those good physiological like adaptations. So accelerative strength early on in the off season, and we start moving more towards like speed strength, and then, or strength speed, and then speed strength movements. Just so
Dude.
like we're constantly moving and pushing that athlete down that continuum of like velocity. So again, now we know that the training stimulus is going to meet the demands of that sport through the strength movements, through the power development. All the power work becomes higher velocity, more reactive, more explosive, more challenging, right? And then ultimately by the end of the off season, and like late off season, our training volume is starting to drop down, because at that point, like we're sprinting a ton, we're hitting a ton, we're throwing a ton. Now the training is the back seat. All the skill stuff is now in the driver's seat. And that's how we send off our guys, whether it doesn't matter what level, like that's how we train all of our guys in the off season. So they can confidently get on the field and know that like, hey, if the coach asks me to run like if we're doing sprints, I'm not going to blow out a hamstring. Like my body, my muscles, like everything, my connective tissue is ready for the stresses that I'm going to experience on the field. And that to me is how we create performance, but also longevity, right? We want to try it. Like you can't completely take out the risk of injury, but you can do a pretty good job of trying to cover all your bases and mitigate it by making sure that moment that athlete steps on the field, they're ready for the stresses that they're going to experience. So
Love that. I love that, man. I love it. It's just like I said earlier, man. It's the preparation and kind of going into spring training, with the confidence I had, knowing of like the daily hard work that we put in. You know what I mean? I went in there feeling like a badass, right? But number two, dude, my body held up, right? So guys come into spring training, and depending on what kind of, how serious they took their off-season routines, like what kind of work they put in, their body may or may not be ready for it, right? Whenever you're starting back up in spring training and you go back into the, high intensity, playing a couple innings, or you're, pitching a couple innings, whatever it is, dude, some things might give out if they're not ready to be, absorbed or, shocked into the system, dude. So that's awesome. I had none of that in the 2 years that I utilized your, working with you in the off season's fantastic. Um, Dude, muscle groups, right? Everybody wants big biceps. Everybody wants sexy triceps. Everybody wants the horseshoe tricep, right? I look at dudes like Jack Leiter, and he's got tree trunks for legs. This dude's got bigger legs than I do waist. Like when you look at a baseball player as a whole, what is the most important muscle group maybe to attack or focus on, right? So like we were doing a lot of athletic workouts, man. I did stuff with you. I'm putting, I'm doing squats, and I'm putting it in the front like this, right? I'm holding the bar and going down like this. That's something that I incorporated like after I was done playing. I still
Mhm.
do it a little bit. It's fantastic. For whatever reason, like that just makes me feel good. You
Yeah.
know what I mean? Is there a certain muscle group that you would attack or focus on as a baseball player, especially as a guy is coming up, growing up? We'll talk about a little bit about like when should you maybe start getting into the weight room here in a little bit, but like what is a muscle group or a specific body part that like a baseball player should maybe focus on or focus a little bit more attention on in the weight room or like when it comes to baseball performance?
Yeah. I'll kind of break it down in terms of movements and then kind of go over some of the like the common challenges or deficiencies that we see with ball players. But again, kind of getting back to the fact that like I look at it as movement, like patterns, right? Like squat, hinge, push, pull, rotation, anti-extension, anti-flexion, like those types of things. So in the course of a workout, like, if it's, I generally, in an ideal world, if I have an athlete that's training with me 5 days a week, they're going to lift 3 days a week and they're going to condition twice a week. We call it the high low model, like high intensity versus low. And it's an undulating wave, right? Because if you're constantly overstressing the system, like we need to down regulate, we need to shift the pendulum the other way so that we're not just always high stress. So if you look at how we're programming that, like in the beginning of the week, we're generally doing our knee dominant, like lower body big lift, whether it be a squat or a split squat, depending upon what is most suitable for that individual. That's what we're loading up, right? That's where we're like, that's our main lift, where it's like, all right, we're trying to drive force outputs, or we're trying to drive like through VBT. Like this is like all about outputs, right? So then we break it up into our accessory movement. So it's generally speaking, like it's a unilateral, like lower body split stance or split squat or reverse lunge or some type of like lunging pattern, whether it be more hip dominant versus knee dominant. So we're kind of looking at how are we checking those boxes across the week. And then on those days, we're looking at like a push and a pull. So generally for me, we kind of pair our day ones, our knee dominant lifts, our more vertically, um, like axial loaded movements, with our top speed days for sprinting, just because the forces that you're experiencing are on a top speed day are more vertical forces. The jumping is more vertical. The squatting, the actual big lift, it's more vertically based, right? In terms of like the vector and the plane that you're working in. Upper body, we're generally doing more like movement in terms of like multi-directional speed, change of direction, agility based stuff in terms of movement. Some of our plyos are going to be more like, frontal plane, like lateral bounding, and the med ball throws we're doing are going to be a little bit more rotational in some component. And so based on the position, or whether this athlete's a pitcher, we might use like a neutral grip bench for our position players, or like a dumbbell bench for my pitchers, where there's a little bit more variability and it's less closed chain. So,
Love it.
um, and then again, same thing, we're always going to do some type of single leg movement, and we're always going to do a push and a pull. Um, and then the last day of the week, we would do like a hinge pattern. So whether that person needs a bilateral or like a staggered stance. Based on if they need more variability, we would choose a staggered stance. If there's somebody who's got a lot of laxity or a lot of hypermobility, we would choose a more bilateral pattern, just because it creates more stiffness and stability.
Mm.
And then again, a single leg movement, and then a push and a pull, right? And with those days, we would do more of like our horizontally based accelerative type of like sprint work. So it's all very calculated in terms of how we're mapping these out. And then the days in between, the Tuesdays and Thursdays, would be just very basic movement and mobility circuits. We do some type of like low stress, low intensity cardio, get on an air bike or something like that, where it's really just like it's mindless, it gets their heart rate up, and we can sustain it. And again, that's where we start to maintain that level of conditioning and can increase that overall like work capacity and ceiling. So I don't like to think of it as muscle groups, right? I think athletes, and especially athletes, need to look at it more as movement patterns. And if we can check all those movement patterns across the course of a week, right? I think then it's a win. And the movements we pick are based on what's most suitable for that athlete, right? What version of a squat for you might be very different version of a squat for somebody else, but it's still a squat. It's still something we can progressively overload over time, and we can create physiological adaptation, right? Same thing with all of our other movements. So I think I want athletes to understand, and from a performance perspective, I'd rather them look at it through the lens of movements. Where I often see a lot of young athletes or athletes in general struggle is what we call motor control, right? Like we have athletes who are big and strong and can create a lot of force, but when it comes to variability and the ability to move from their middle, right, from proximal to distal, again, this is getting back to the kinematic sequence. They can't move from their trunk and pelvis, right? Those two things is where all force is originated, whether we're sprinting, we're throwing, we're jumping. And if we don't understand that context of motor control, it's going to affect the efficiency of our sequence, the longevity of our, like how we can, how off, like how long we can create those outputs. And that's, to me, is like more efficient kinematic sequence is going to improve performance and decrease likelihood of injury. If you look at all the research out there, that most injuries are due to the lack of control of the pelvis and the trunk and rib cage. So a lot of the things that we focus on is, yes, we want an athlete to be big, strong, robust, but if they move poorly, then that's something we need to address first, right? Because think of it like, if a structure doesn't move efficiently and we put more strength, power, and speed on top of it, it's just going to put more stress on the structure. It's going to put more stress on the joints. And that's exactly what you experienced earlier. Like you were saying, is like you put a lot of strength, but you didn't move any better. In fact, you started to move worse as you started to pile all those physiological adaptations onto your system. So that's where, if you're continually prioritizing movement patterns and quality of movement, as you start adding these good like physical like attributes and qualities, like things are just going to continue to get better, and your joints are going to feel better, and you're going to move a lot better. So where we see that is, again, like proximal motor control of the pelvis. Like, can I rotate my pelvis free of my trunk, and can I rotate my trunk free of my pelvis? And then from there, right, like that's dissociation or shoulder and hip separation in a T. Like most athletes can't do that. So we teach them in all sorts of different, like using constraints through like 3D straps, and moving from the ground to like up to their feet. And again, this is where we kind of start early in the season. If the athlete's lacking these things, we're addressing those things early on in the off season before we start piling all these like high stress, high output movements. And then from there, like the biggest thing also for most throwers is they can't move their scapula properly on their rib cage, and they lack the congruency between their scapula and their humerus. And so again, that's the linking system between the, like I talked earlier about the kinematic sequences. You have your pelvis, you have your trunk, and your scapula moving on your rib cage is what transitions and translates all that energy from your rib cage and trunk to your arm. But if that structure doesn't move or doesn't have good stability on the rib cage, well, you've lost all your like your energy, and then you're also creating more stress, right? Because athletes are great at creating some type of compensation, right? Often at the expense of structures. And that's where like guys can do that, but they can only do it for so long until something breaks down. So we
Mhm.
do a ton of stuff that really emphasizes the ability to move the scapula on the rib cage. Can I move congruently between, like we call it reciprocal movement patterns, or like we always bring it back to gait patterns, right? If you look at a body and a structure, how it walks, right? Like your pelvis rotates one way, your trunk rotates the other way, right? Everything in the body happens equal and opposite. It's just the laws of physics. So if we can understand that at its most simplest terms, and essentially throwing is gait, right? Like throwing is equal and opposite. If you look at how the structure of the body moves and all those types of things, it's like once you understand that and can see that, like it's providing a really simple frameworks. But that's where most athletes really are limited. So instead of doing like a really heavy row pattern, can you do it in a split stance where you can rotate your trunk over a stable pelvis, and can you move your scapula on your rib cage? Can you do those efficiently? Right? Like, or is it really a big struggle? Do you feel like you're kind of stuck and you're not moving freely? Right? Like I'd rather focus on outputs on my big lifts, squat, deadlift, bench, right? Those are all about moving weight, moving it as fast as you can, right? Then we move to our more accessory work, and that's more motor sensory, think brain to body. Like, am I going to feel abs? Am I going to feel serratus? Am I going to feel obliques? Am I going to feel hamstring? Like, you want to feel stuff in those. So essentially, right, like those big lifts drive force outputs, drive other things and good physiological adaptations. And your accessory lifts are what's driving consistent, like you're reinforcing movement patterns so that over the course of an off season, you're 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 not you're not pushing yourself further down that stiffness and rigidity continuum like we talked about earlier. We're still using those, motor sensory movements and those accessory lifts to maintain movement variability. So that's as
Oh my
simply as I could put it.
dude, that is lights out. I think if anybody needed, maybe an idea of where they need to go if they are in the state of New Jersey or North New Jersey for an off season or in season training, that's probably the promo right there. That's mind blowing. So being able to focus on being an athlete, training athletically, right, training specific movements, not so much thinking about certain exercises, right, how that all like fits into the program and the specific needs of the individual athlete, man. It's like what I was getting from what you're saying. It's like, dude, if I needed the squat, you are going to take me through an evaluation and see what I am deficient in. You're going
Mhm.
to see what I need. And maybe it's not load the bar on my back, right? That's why I'm doing the squat, in the front, right? Just
Yep.
I may need that exercise. I may need that movement, right? In
Mhm.
order to kind of get where I'm going, get that maximum output, right? Get what we want, but it might be a different variation depending on what I need, what my body can handle, especially, talked a lot about the pelvis core. Dude, that's fantastic. That's amazing. So you touched on young athletes struggling, right? In certain movements,
Mhm.
certain workouts, certain programs. Dude, I wanted to ask when, so let's just say a 14 to a 21-year-old, right? That's man, they might want to get in the weight room. They might want to max out. They might want to get big. When I was coming up, whether I'm in middle school or high school, like my dad, he was a PhD. He taught gross anatomy, right? So he worked with like cadavers and stuff. He knew the
Yeah.
human body. He always told me, dude, do not, don't max out, right? Don't You're not working out until you are, matured, maybe until you hit puberty, or maybe until like, your body can handle it, right? Until you're a little bit bigger. So it's like, dude, I wasn't going into the weight room at 12 or 13 years old and blowing out. I wasn't maxing out, bench press at 85 pounds, whatever that was. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
He alluded to a couple times like growth plates, right? Your growth plates are growing, whatever that is, man. I don't even like remember it so long ago. What does a 14 to 21-year-old, like somebody that maybe is starting to get serious about baseball, serious about sports, maybe is interested in like pursuing this as a career and wants to
Mhm.
take their career to the next level. They want to maximize their ability. They want to maximize their time and their effort in the weight room. What maybe do they not know or understand yet? And B, when is the right time to start getting in there and getting after it? Is there a certain, would you say that it's like, hey, dude, maybe wait until you are developed, maybe wait until you're a man, right? That's if we're talking about,
Mhm.
young men, right? Is it maybe like a puberty thing when my body starts developing a little bit more? Is that maybe when, like, what's your take on that? Like, when should players start getting a little bit more serious about the weight room? When can they start getting after it in the weight room? And maybe what don't they understand yet about it?
Yeah. So, in speaking about the young athlete, I think the biggest thing we have to continually focus on is just building athleticism. And I encourage athletes to play as many sports as possible up until high school, and once they figure out, like, hey, this is what I want to play in college, whatever that sport might be. I think training has its place with all of those individuals. I think the cool thing with young athletes who have 0 to maybe any training age, like, it's all about like minimal effective dose, right? You don't need to do much to create adaptations with those young athletes, right? You can be super simple, super basic, again, focusing on those same movement patterns that we would with some of our more advanced athletes. But like, you don't need to do much, like, and keep it as simple as possible, right? Because it's all, to me, when I'm working with those athletes, it's all about what are we doing now to create the foundation that you're going to build your athletic career on. And so we the only reason we have to start getting, like, I don't want to say complicated, but start to, utilize different training tactics with older athletes is because, once you have a long training age, you need a lot more intensity, a lot more very like other things that's going to continue to drive adaptation, right? Like somebody who's been training 3 years, whether they're, a high school athlete or even a pro, like, what takes them to create adaptation is a lot more force, a lot more, like, it's just a lot more things and like stuff you have to throw into their training program to continue to push them and create some type of adaptation. With young athletes, like, if you're going to squat, do goblet squats. If you're going to, like, again, push and pull, lunging, like, do make sure you're sprinting, right? The only way you're going to get faster is if you're sprinting at max effort on a regular basis, right? Not conditioning, not like doing like conditioning sprints, like making sure you're providing adequate rest for sprint work and actually executing sprints at maximum intensity, right? I think if we can expose young athletes to that type of stuff early on, like, there's a window early on in an athlete's career where they can create like it's favorable for them to create like speed adaptation. It gets a little bit harder as athletes become more mature and stuff like that, but I think, you can train an athlete through puberty, right? So when they get outside on the back end of that, now they have a little bit better proprioception, again, better motor control, better understanding of how to move their body in space. And then, like, you can just start doing a little bit more with those athletes, right? Because I think a lot of times, biggest thing I notice with young athletes who are getting into training early on, especially athletes that are growing, like young male athletes that are growing at a fast rate, like, they have no kinesthetic awareness. They have no idea where their body is in space.
They're baby
They
giraffes.
Yeah, they, like, we talked about that proximal control, right? Like the proximal to distal, like, they work the other way. They think about movement as what's happening at their feet and their hands. So the sooner you can get them understanding of how movement starts from the middle, it has a really profound effect. And again, it's minimal effective dose. You don't need a ton of, like, loads. You don't need a ton of intensity. Like, you can do a lot of work with really simple basic things. Um, and again, the sophisticated stuff doesn't really come along until, like, you've been training 3-4 years, and, like, sooner or later you're going to just stop adapting to the same methodology. So, like, if you pull those tools out of your toolbox too early with these young athletes, when you need them later on in their athletic career, you're not going to be able to you're not going to get the full
Not as
extent.
effective.
Yeah. And so I think really just slow cooking these athletes and like building a robust athlete that's really meant for the long haul. And so the biggest thing, like, especially with young athletes, that I would definitely stay away from is like any like heavy axial loaded, meaning, like, you don't want to do like heavy back squats. Like, you don't want to, like, for me, like, I don't do heavy like barbell back squats with any of my athletes. The only person I would or individual I would say that's necessary for is if you're a power lifter, right? Like, that's your sport, so you need to do that. But I think for young athletes, like just train the movement patterns, build strength, right? Like, and you'll see pretty quickly, like if you're just creating good, simple, progressive overload over time, you'll start to see when the body, like, your adaptations, your gains, like all of your strength improvements start to slow down and kind of peak. And it's like, all right, now I need to start doing some more things to continue to drive adaptation. That's where you start to pull on other things. That's where you start to use other tools, different methodologies, generally after an athlete's been training for a good amount of time. So
Love it.
yeah, I mean, hopefully that answers your question, but I think it's not as complex as most people would think. My goal is for them play as many sports, and if they're going to train, keep it as simple as possible. Don't overthink it. Just look at movement, right? Squat, hinge, push, pull, sprint, jump, like all those things. Like we want good physical literacy, right?
Mm.
Sports provide great physical literacy, right? Like, so if you go to, you play football, then you play basketball, then you play baseball, like you're exposing your body to so many different inputs. So the way you respond to those things is that's how you build athleticism. But the challenge is like that we're getting farther and farther away from that. Like athletes are sticking to one sport even in middle school. So our goal with the training is like, if they're not playing multiple sports, how can we provide that variability and stimulus that they would otherwise get playing other sports?
Oh,
And the strength work is really just secondary, so that like most young kids, if they want to sprint faster or accelerate better, like they need to move better, but they can't accelerate because they can't put any force on the ground because they're weak. So we use strength as an opportunity to create more force with overall just dynamic movement. So that's
love it.
kind of how we look at it. And we don't want lifters, we want athletes, right? At the end of the day, the most important thing is like, and I said it earlier, is like, how is our training preparing our athletes for the demands of their sport, right? If we're just like lifting, like we're not adequately preparing them for their sport. Like they have to sprint, they have to do high velocity movements so that when they get out on the field, they've done it before, right?
I love it.
Then they've
Oh,
been exposed to it.
we don't want lifters. We want athletes, right? Keep it simple. That's absolutely fantastic. The physical literacy part. I mean, dude, it makes a ton of sense, right? So I even just how I like presented the question was a little complex, and the answer, you know what I mean? Keep it simple, right? Just do the movements. I love that, man. I love it. When we talk about supplements, dude, this is
Mhm.
something that depending on where you're at, who you talk to, who you ask, you might get a different sort of answer, dude. So I being in the professional ranks, when you're at the spring training complex or you're at the facility or you're at the field or you're at the weight room, whether it's in-house or you go somewhere else, like there are supplements open to you. And whether you're in middle school or high school or you're in college or you're a minor league athlete, big league or whatever it is, there's a whole plethora of supplements open to you. You can go on YouTube or Google and see whether they're illegal or they're NSF certified, right? Or you read a whole bunch of reviews. Like when it comes to supplements, what do you recommend and why, as it pertains to a baseball player remaining
Mhm.
healthy, remaining strong, right? Like protein, pre-workout, amino acids, BCAAs, like creatine, dude. I've I don't I've never really dabbled too much in the pre-workout stuff because when my face starts itching, I got a problem, dude. I got a
Yeah.
problem, right? I remember going to you a couple times, and dude, we actually like changed my diet a little bit because I would come to you and I would like tucker out quick. I would tire out quick. We would do like reverse lunges, like single leg squats or single leg lunges. And dude, I would do one rep and I'd feel like I had to throw up. Right. So I'm going to pump some pre-workout in there on top of that. Like, dude, I'm going to projectile vomit. You know what I mean? But when I'm talking about, different types of, creatine obviously has a lot of, you have to have a lot of water intake, right? Dude. And then protein, there's different types of
Yeah.
protein. Dude, I was taking certain proteins before I went to bed so I could get that protein burst overnight. I don't know if it casein or I don't even know how to say it. Like there's
Yep.
different types of stuff. There's different costs associated with it. And obviously like there's different stuff that's available to different types of people. Obviously, when you get into the professional ranks, the NSF certified
Yeah.
for sport, I don't even know how to say it. Like that's the only type of products that you can pick from, or else you
Mhm.
run the risk of
Yep.
getting popped for a positive test. right? You see that all the time. Dude, what kind of supplements would you recommend? Maybe to somebody trying to, like I said, maximize their ability in the weight room, maximize their inputs and their outputs. Like, is protein the way to go as opposed to like, doing an amino acid? Like, what would you recommend and why?
So I think the biggest thing I want athletes to understand is like supplements are just that. They supplement what you're not getting through your own nutritional, you know, whatever you're consuming from a normal meals and nutritional standpoint. So I think as athletes go, like the biggest thing I'll look at first if we're addressing nutrition is like protein intake. And that's kind of based on like your body weight. And so a lot of the research says that if you can consume like zero point 0.7 grams to a gram of like per pound of body weight in like protein per day, that's ideal because that's really important in terms of maintaining lean muscle mass, right? Because if you're training and you're breaking down muscle, like we need to like build it up through like muscle protein synthesis. So without protein, we can't do that, right? So it's really important that like ideally you're getting, again, if you're a 200-pound dude, you should be getting, like at least 200 grams of protein on a regular basis. And that's a lot for a lot of like young kids to start to realize, but I would look at that lever first, right? And then supplements are such that, hey, if I need to make up another 30 to 40 grams of protein after my workout, right? Like eat breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and I'm 40 grams short of protein, well, consume a protein shake. And that's like 100% whey protein, stuff like that. Um, the timing of that, like, it, the research says it's not super important in terms of like, you don't have to consume it right after your training session, but anywhere between 30 minutes to 60 minutes after your training session, and it's adequate. But really, your body fluctuates between like muscle protein, like muscle breakdown and muscle protein synthesis. And as we feed our body with protein, like it's aiding in that protein synthesis, the building up of our muscles. Where BCAs come in is that it just kind of helps jumpstart that, right? Like if you include it with your proteins, it just allows that process to happen a little bit faster, a little bit easier, right? And again, that you could use that as a post workout shake or whatever you want to do. Um, and then as far as like other vitamins or things like that, like I'm a big believer in creatine. For anybody who's training, the research out there is like it's really good. It just allows us to like it's just better in terms of energy transport for our training sessions and things like that. There's
Is
been
that an intra workout thing?
normally for me, like timing on that is it doesn't have to be pre or post. I would just recommend athletes like maybe have it in like juice every morning.
Okay.
I'd rather see athletes like consume it at the same time every day and have it with some type of like sugar or carbohydrate because it just helps get the creatine where it needs to go. It helps if you drink it with water, it doesn't pass through the bloodstream quite as easily. But if
Okay.
you have it with juice, it just gets through to the bloodstream a little bit easier. So I would say most athletes should be taking creatine. And there's a lot of research also from like a concussion standpoint, like in terms of athletes that, yeah, it's pretty wild, but like overloading on creatine to like mitigate the risk of like head injuries, like if you're like a hockey player or football player, like it just helps protect the brain a little bit. So like like overloading with some of that stuff, like there is research that shows like it does help. um but I would say like a lot of people give creatine a bad rap, but I don't think like most of the research I've consumed is like it all has good stuff to say.
Love that.
um and as far as like other stuff, like you had mentioned, like protein with casein, like that's just a longer, like slower releasing type of protein. That's, you know, when we sleep, we start to break down muscle. Whereas this just kind of helps again that muscle protein synthesis as we sleep. It just allows us to continually build muscle like overnight, or at least slows down the breakdown. Um, and then multivitamins, things like that, like fish oils if you want it.
I'm
You
on
know,
that.
a multivitamin with like magnesium or some type of like vitamin D and things like that. So I think those are to me are like the big rocks. But again, I I think the biggest thing I want athletes to appreciate is like nutrition is what's driving your training, right? Like you can't have success in training without prioritizing nutrition as well. And then the other big lever that I would really emphasize with young athletes is the quality of their sleep, the duration of their sleep. That's just as important, right? As training hard in the gym and focusing on nutrition, we have to create a good lifestyle habits with sleep, right? We need good sleep hygiene, making sure we have like a consistent, sleep wake cycle, right? Like trying to go to bed and waking up at similar times throughout the week, right? Like those should be all pretty similar. Like if you're within 30 to 60 minutes, like it's just going to improve the sleep architecture, right? Like the structure of your sleep. Um, and I think that's something that's really important that's, with technology and all that stuff, like it's just kids are not getting quality sleep and they're not getting adequate amount of sleep. So if we can prioritize at least 7 to 8 hours of sleep a night with good consistent sleep and wake times, I think that along with good nutrition and supplements if you choose to use them, that's a huge game changer that like if athletes can manage that, it's going to really, it's a force multiplier in their training programs.
I
So
love that, dude. I love that. I that's something that I've always kind of not struggled with, but what you're saying makes a ton of sense, right? So, dude, it kind of goes back to what you were saying as well with the young athletes struggling, right? Keep
mhm.
it simple, focus on athleticism. You don't have to overcomplicate things, right? Dude,
Yeah.
it's you can have a whey protein, you can have the creatine, right? You don't have to get too crazy. Keep it simple. Maybe in the morning with a multivitamin, and dude, that's awesome. The fish oil is something that I benefit from, something that I really had to utilize and kind of put into my routine daily, monthly, annually, ever since I kind of hurt my back in 2015. That's amazing. I love it. I am extremely, extremely grateful for you being here and your time. I got one more question, but one and a half more questions for you. So you've trained literally some of the best and most talented athletes in the world. However you want to say it, that is true. I'm not lying there. And you are the premier guy to go to in New Jersey. Everybody, please check out Mickey. Check out the Annex, Chatham, New Jersey. It's incredible. Dude, what do those best athletes do? So, like, you are training some of the top tier athletes, not just in baseball, but in multiple sports. We alluded to that earlier. Like, what did they do different, maybe, than their competition? So they're going to separate themselves and either progress, or you're going to just remain complacent, or you're going to decline, right? You're not
Mhm.
going to maximize your ability. You're not going to maximize your career. The ones that do, what do they do different? How do they stand out, right? Obviously, like the talent is top tier. If you want to
Yeah.
be a top tier athlete, you have to have talent. Aside from that, like, is it a discipline thing? Is it a mindset thing? Can they just like reach inside and trick themselves and get motivated? Like, what do they do differently that maybe somebody that's in the nine hole, like I was in high school, can maybe start implementing and try to start thinking about?
Yeah, let's first not discredit like what genetics and just raw talent play into this, right? Like a lot of these athletes who are at the highest level, they just picked the right parents, right? Like they got lucky. They had a good, really good genes, and that's like, the athletes that can just throw hard, right? Like they can like super fast, right? Like now, not to say those qualities can't be trained and improved upon. Um, and then like I mean, baseball is a very interesting sport where like there's so much skill involved, right? Like we've all been around those guys who can just put a barrel on a baseball and like they can roll out of bed and do it, right?
That's right.
Better than anybody. And I mean, yeah, they've worked hard to get to the highest level and maintain being relevant and all that stuff. And but I think, notwithstanding all of those things, but I think the biggest thing I've noticed is that that stuff and skill gets you to the highest level. I think what keeps you around is the athletes that are super disciplined in every aspect, right? Like the way I look at it, and I had a podcast with one of my former athletes a couple weeks ago, and we talked about this. And I think if an athlete can manage the physical preparation, if they can manage the lifestyle, like we talked earlier, nutrition, sleep, all that stuff, and if they can manage all of the other off field distractions, right? I think you can be pretty successful at the highest level if you're hitting like two of those three things, right? I think the athletes and the individuals that are competing at the highest level, but they are doing it for the longest amount of time. They're staying healthy. There's longevity. They're the guys who've been around forever. Like they're the ones that are checking all three of those boxes, right? Like they treat everything with discipline. They do everything with intention. They do all the boring stuff that nobody wants to do, right? And like they just do it every single day, and in because that's part of their approach, right? Like they manage the things that they can manage. Like they control the controllables really, really well, right? Like, and I think another thing is like they can just delay gratification, right? They just know that like over time they have patience. They know that like I gotta do this. They're regimented in their routines, but they also provide flexibility and variability and able to like they're not so structured and stuck into those routines that like like because you can also become pretty fragile. Like if you can only go out and compete if you've had coffee in the morning and 3 egg omelet with spinach and your BCAs and all, like if that's the only if that's the only thing that like if you have to have that routine every single time to go out and compete, and if you can't have it, like now you you're limited in your capabilities, like that can also push you the wrong way, right? But I mean, I really just think it's like one of the simplest terms. They just do the stuff that nobody wants to do,
I love it,
and
dude. I love it.
they do it with like intention, like. And I think the cool thing is not only have I been around some really high level achievers in the sports world, but I've also been around I've had some really good mentors in the business world who have done pretty amazing things, and like it's no different. Like what those people are doing in the business world, or whatever their endeavor is, like they're like it's almost like a borderline like OCD. Like they just become so obsessed with the pursuit and the process that the results don't matter, right? Like they're so passionate about like the process and always trying to get better, always looking for opportunities to get better, right? Like the best athletes do it, the most successful business people, like they're never satisfied, right? Like they're always looking at opportunities every single day where they can be better, right? And but being patient, because it just takes a ton of time and patience to to see these things come to fruition. So
Dude, yes, yes, yes. I feel like since we kind of started the podcast game maybe around the same time. So I just wanted to plug yours, the MTB, excuse me, Performance Project.
yep,
I will get those tags going out, man. I'll make sure that my audience gets to check that out. But when I started in this podcast game, I started consuming others, right? Like
mhm,
people that I would look up to, maybe for me, it's like, dude, I really wanted to learn how to run a business. I wanted to learn how to start it. I wanted to learn how to go all in. So I'm consuming people like their content, Ed Milet, Bedros
yep,
Koulian, right? Alex Hormozy, and they
yep,
all talk about that, right? Like what separates people? Talk about the discipline, um, talk about the patience, delaying gratification, dude.
yep,
That is huge. I absolutely love that. I just wanted to touch on that. That's fantastic, dude. Yeah, it fires me up, man. Doing the little things, like the vanilla things, I think is what a college coach had come on here before and said, like,
mhm,
dude, the reason why we are a top 10 program in the country is because we obsessively do the vanilla things, right? It's not the
yeah,
sexy stuff, but we will do
absolutely,
it, right? We'll do the rundowns, and we'll do the cuts and relays better than most. And it's like, well, they're in the College World Series for a reason, right?
yeah.
Last question
And
I got
and
for you.
and
My
when
bad, my
things
bad.
get hard, and they will, right? They don't quit. And
Mm,
they look at those challenges as opportunities to find blind spots and grow from them.
yes.
I think that's to me that's a huge one too, is that like most people who don't have that growth mindset, anytime they're faced with any challenges, like they're like, all right, well, I can't do this. I quit. Like I can't make it through. And it's like, well, you could literally get through anything so long as you're capable and willing to learn from it and grow from it. And I think that's another another thing, again, in business and in sports and in like just in life. Like if you can understand that, like if you're not challenging yourself, you're not getting better, right? And I can kind of look at my own evolution as a coach, as an entrepreneur, as a business owner. Like I kind of go in and out in ebbs and flows of like periods where like I feel like I've got a handle on everything. And then I get into periods where I'm like, wow, I'm struggling to stay afloat. I got all these different things I'm trying to build and work on. And it's like through those periods is where I grow, right? Like I expand in those periods, and that's where the growth happens. So if you're somebody who's unwilling to kind of go through those periods and kind of stop when things get hard, like you're just not going to see the back end of that. You're not going to see success, like, or at least you're not going to get to where you want to go. And I think like anybody who's built anything worth anything, like it's just like it's just the constant ebb and flow of that, like on a daily basis. So you got to get comfortable with that. You got to understand like that's part of it. You got to embrace it, and the only way to get through it is to go through it.
I love that. I love that. Just like the resilience, the sticking with it. It's like when there's a roadblock up or there's a boundary up, it's like, oh crap, dude, where do I go next? Like, what's the next thing I go to, as opposed to like figuring out how to get through, right?
Yep.
Like being comfortable, being uncomfortable is something that I've always heard.
Yep.
But I was listening to something yesterday from one of these men that I mentioned earlier, where it was like the way that he said it was absolutely incredible. I think it was actually Alex Hormozy. He said something where it's like, if you look at any situation, and this is how I view it, this is how I kind of break down what I'm going to do and how I'm going to do the hard things, stay resilient, and do the vanilla things. He said, you can look at any situation, any story, and it's like you can kind of take a step back from your personal situation and say, whoa, I'm struggling right now. Like, this is a struggle story. What would the hero of this story do? What would the action be? If this is a movie, like what would the hero in this story do? And then he'd be like, well, I just do it. And like I've done that over 10 plus years, and now I am working my way towards being a billionaire. And it's like, oh wow. Okay. So like to hit on the delaying gratification thing again, it's like, dude, at least, trying to relate to that. It's like, dude, I had to grind my beanbag through the minor leagues being nobody, right? And just get a cup of glory. You know what I mean? Like just being able to do that and delay the gratification is fantastic. Absolutely love that. Last question I got for you, bro.
Yeah.
This is the 9-hole podcast, right? Where I am just speaking to the next generation of 9-hole hitters. Whether they're underdeveloped, undersized, underappreciated, underseen, whatever, undervalued. Man, when you're thinking of a 9-hole hitter, right, in a lineup, the last guy in the order, the underdog, what is a good 9-hole hitter to you? What qualities or traits do you think about when you think about a good 9-hole hitter?
I mean, I think it goes a lot of what we just said. I think somebody who's willing to go out there and do what it takes to contribute, like be a team player, know where you are and like what your strengths are and utilize those strengths, but also say like, all right, what are some of the things I can get better at? And of those things, like, who do I go speak to? How can I get the right knowledge? Who can I communicate with to help fill those gaps? And then now just go out and execute on it. Because I think, again, like people who are willing to be successful or want to be successful, they're seeking out ways on a daily basis of how they can get better, whether it's physical, whether it's emotional, whether it's psychological. Like, I think those are opportunities where you might not be where you want to be right now, right? But just know, like, just don't be outworked, right? Because that's one thing, you can control, right? I know at the end of the day, like, I built my business because I wasn't the smartest individual. I knew training. I knew very little about business, but I just learned every day. Like I made a ton of mistakes, but I learned from my mistakes. Right. And I think it's one of those things where like, you gotta continually go out every day to seek out challenges, seek out opportunities where you feel like you can grow and can improve, so that you're constantly leveling up and making sure like, hey, did I get 1% better today? If I can say that, like if I, create little wins over time every single day, like that starts to have compounding effects. And before you know it, that delayed gratification means, big things. And now you're looking on the other end of a lot of effort, a lot of time and energy, and you'll have something you'll be proud of. So
Amen. Mickey, that's fantastic. Thank you for your time, dude. Thank you for, sharing your expertise, like just kind of blessing us, dude, with the knowledge and the insight that you've accrued, like from the sports performance side of things. Mickey Brueckner, everybody, check him out. Annex sportsperformance.com, the MTB Performance Project. Mickey, thank you so much, brother, for being here. I appreciate you, man, and we look forward, hopefully, to having you on the show again sometime soon.
Yeah, Ian, I appreciate it as well, brother. Really proud of what you're doing, and I think it's always great to see people who are, make this transition and start to see somewhere where they can make an impact, and you're certainly doing that. So I'm proud of you, brother. I'm happy that we were able to have this conversation today. So thank you.
Likewise. Pleasure's all mine, Mickey. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. This is the 9-Hole Podcast. We will catch you here in a couple more hours as we dive into Emilio Pagan's story, relief pitcher for the Cincinnati Reds. Thank you, everybody, for tuning here, and thank you again, Mickey.